In the dim flicker of a lantern's glow, deep within the shadowed confines of a crumbling attic in rural Georgia, a young historian named Elias Thorne sifted through yellowed papers that hadn't seen daylight in over a century. His fingers trembled as he uncovered a leather-bound journal, its pages brittle and stained with what might have been ink or blood. The date scrawled on the first entry, 1857, the author's name, Dr. Harlan Whitaker, a man whose legacy had been scrubbed from the annals of medical history. But it was the words that stopped Elias cold, a clinical confession of an experiment so grotesque, so rooted in the brutal logic of the era, that it seemed to whisper from the grave. To prove the Negro's insensibility to pain, I selected twins from the quarters. What I witnessed that night shattered every presumption I held. Before we go further, subscribe and hit the bell. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. The story begins not in that attic, but on the sprawling acres of Willow Bend Plantation, a sprawling empire of cotton fields that stretched like pale scars across the Georgia landscape in the mid-1850s. Harlan Whitaker wasn't just any plantation owner. He was a man of letters and science, a self-taught physician who had studied under the flickering gas lamps of Charleston academies before inheriting his family's holdings. Tall and gaunt, with eyes like polished obsidian, Whitaker embodied the contradictions of his time, a believer in progress, yet chained to the rotting institution of slavery. His wife Eliza, a fragile beauty from a fading Savannah lineage, managed the big house with a quiet authority, her smiles masking the fractures in their union. Together, they presided over a world built on forced labor, where the cries of the enslaved were drowned out by the creak of whips and the endless rhythm of the harvest. Willow Bend was no ordinary spread. Whispers among the field hands spoke of it as a place where the boundaries of medicine and mastery blurred. Whitaker had arrived in 1848, fresh from experiments on ether and mesmerism, convinced that the human body held secrets waiting to be unlocked. But his true obsession lay in the pseudoscience of the day, the notion, peddled in medical journals and southern drawing rooms, that those of African descent possessed a unique physiology, a diminished capacity for pain, a resilience born of divine design to endure the rigors of bondage. It was a convenient myth, one that justified the lash and the yoke, allowing men like Whitaker to sleep soundly while their wealth grew on the backs of the suffering. The twins in question were born to a woman named Mira, one of the plantation's most valued laborers. Mira had been brought to Willow Bend as a girl of 14, her spirit unbroken despite the chains that bound her to the soil. She toiled in the weaving shed, her hands calloused from spinning cotton into thread that would line the pockets of distant merchants. Her husband, Josiah, worked the fields, his broad shoulders bearing the weight of plows and punishments alike. When Mira gave birth to the twins, Ebon and Silas, in the sweltering summer of 1852, it was under the watchful eye of Eliza Whitaker herself. The mistress had a peculiar interest in the births on the plantation, overseeing what she called the continuation of the stock, a veiled reference to the forced pairings orchestrated to bolster the workforce. Mira's joy at her sons was short-lived. By their third year, rumors swirled that Josiah had been sold off to settle a debt, his absence leaving a void that echoed through the quarters like a perpetual dirge. Whitaker first noticed the twins during a routine inspection of the children's health. At 5 years old, Ebon and Silas were mirror images. Lithe, with skin like polished mahogany and eyes that held a quiet defiance, they moved with an uncanny synchronicity, laughing in unison, mirroring each other's gestures as if bound by an invisible thread. To Whitaker, they were perfect subjects, not just for their bond, but for the opportunity to test a hypothesis that could elevate his standing among the Southern intelligentsia. He had read treatises claiming that slaves' supposed pain tolerance stemmed from a primitive nervous system, less sensitive to agony than that of whites. If proven, it would silence abolitionist critics and affirm the natural order. But Whitaker's methods veered into the forbidden. Ether, laudanum, and other substances were scarce on the plantation, so he devised his own trial, one that skirted the edges of legality, even in an age when such boundaries were fluid for men of his station. The experiment unfolded on a moonless night in the fall of 1857, in a secluded outbuilding behind the smokehouse, what the hands called the punishment shed. Whitaker had prepared meticulously, drawing blood samples under the guise of a vaccination drive and noting the boy's vital signs in his journal. Mira, sensing something amiss, pleaded with Eliza to intervene, but the mistress turned away, her face a mask of practiced indifference. "The doctor knows best," she murmured, retreating to her embroidery. That night, as the twins were led inside, the air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and fear. Whitaker administered a crude incision. Nothing fatal, he assured himself, just enough to observe. He expected stoicism, a blank stare, the myth made flesh. Instead, as the blade met skin, the boys' synchronized screams pierced the darkness, their small bodies convulsing in shared torment. Eben clutched Silas's hand, their cries intertwining like a lament for all the silenced pains of Willow Bend. What Whitaker witnessed that night didn't just shock him. It unraveled the fragile web of his beliefs. The twins' agony was not muted, but amplified, their bond turning individual suffering into a chorus of anguish that echoed long after the wounds were bandaged. In his journal, his handwriting grew erratic. Their pain was not absent, it was doubled, a mirror of the soul's torment. Have I glimpsed the lie we all live? Yet true to the era's code, he buried the findings, destroying notes and warning the hands against speaking of it. The twins survived, but the incident marked them. They grew withdrawn, their once playful synchronicity now a shield against the world. Decades passed, and Willow Bend faded into obscurity. The plantation changed hands after the war, its fields left fallow as Reconstruction crumbled, and Jim Crow rose like a new shadow. Mira died in 1872, her grave unmarked on the edge of the property. Her stories of that night passed in hushed tones to her grandchildren, the twins separated by circumstance, Ebon fleeing north, Silas remaining to labor, carried the weight silently, their lives a testament to resilience amid erasure. Official records from the county courthouse mentioned nothing of Whitaker's treatments. His death in 1881 was noted only as a sudden decline, his papers burned by Eliza to preserve the family's name. It wasn't until the 1920s, during a drought that cracked the earth open, that the first cracks in the silence appeared. Workers digging a new well unearthed small bones. Animal, they said at first, but a local midwife recognized the human curve of a child's rib. The coroner, under pressure from lingering whispers, quietly reburied them without fanfare. Yet the incident lingered in oral histories, fragments shared around kitchen tables in the black community of nearby towns. The doctor cut into the light of Willow Bend, one elder would say, and the darkness swallowed it whole. By the 1950s, as civil rights stirred, a descendant of Mira's line, a schoolteacher named Lena Hargrove, began piecing together family lore. She scoured church ledgers and interviewed elders, but the trail went cold until a fire in the old Whitaker Manor in 1963 revealed hidden compartments. Letters emerged, hinting at Whitaker's regrets, but the full journal eluded her. It would take another half-century, into the early 2000s, for Elias Thorne to stumble upon it in that attic, donated anonymously to a historical society. As he read, the weight of forgotten truths pressed down, how one man's illegal test meant to affirm cruelty, instead exposed its depths. This revelation, emerging over 150 years later, forces us to confront not just Whitaker's hubris, but the systemic veil that hid such abuses. Plantations like Willow Bend weren't anomalies. They were the machinery of an economy built on denial. The myth of painlessness served to dehumanize, to justify programs of forced labor and reproduction that tore families apart. Mira's twins, in their shared suffering, became unwitting witnesses to the lie, a pain so profound it bound them and ultimately unbound the silence. As Elias Thorne turned the brittle pages of Dr. Harlan Whitaker's journal, the attic air grew thicker, laden with the dust of unspoken atrocities. Each entry pulled him deeper into the labyrinth of Willow Bend's hidden history, where the line between healer and tormentor blurred into oblivion. The doctor's words, penned in a meticulous script that faltered only in moments of doubt, chronicled not just the experiment, but the quiet unraveling of a man's soul. The twins' eyes, Whitaker wrote on a date smeared by time, held no veil of indifference. Their torment was a revelation, raw and unrelenting, forcing me to question the very foundations upon which our society rests. Elias paused, his breath catching. This was no mere medical curiosity. It was a confession wrapped in pseudoscience, a desperate bid to rationalize the irrational. Back in 1857, the aftermath of that moonless night rippled through Willow Bend like a shadow lengthening at dusk. The twins, Eben and Silas, were confined to the infirmary, a drafty room in the big house's annex, stocked with Whitaker's elixirs and instruments that gleamed coldly under oil lamps. Mira was allowed to tend them, her presence a concession born of Whitaker's fleeting guilt. She moved like a ghost through the corridors, her once steady hands now trembling as she applied salves to the boy's wounds. "Hush now, my lights," she'd whisper, her voice a fragile thread weaving through the silence imposed on the quarters. The other hands avoided her gaze, their own fears a communal shroud. To speak of the doctor's tests was to invite the overseer's lash, or worse, a midnight sail to some distant hell. Whitaker, meanwhile, retreated into a frenzy of revision. He pored over borrowed volumes from Atlanta's medical libraries, seeking precedents for what he'd witnessed. The prevailing theories of the time, echoed in pamphlets by figures like Samuel Cartwright, who coined ailments like drapetomania to pathologize escape, insisted on the enslaved's physiological detachment from suffering. It was a doctrine that absolved the master, turning brutality into benevolence. Yet the twins' synchronized agony had pierced that illusion. In private, Whitaker experimented on himself, pricking his arm with the same scalpel, noting how his own flinch paled against the boy's shared convulsions. "Their bond amplifies," he scribbled one evening, the ink bleeding like tears. "Pain, in isolation a spark, becomes in union a conflagration." But publicly, he maintained the facade, boasting at county gatherings of Willow Bend's advanced health regimen, crediting it for the plantation's productivity. Eliza Whitaker observed her husband's turmoil with a detachment honed by years of complicity. She had long managed the program of continuation, as she euphemistically termed the forced unions that replenished the labor force. Pairings were calculated like crop rotations. Strong field hands matched with fertile women from the weaving sheds, their offspring inventoried in ledgers alongside mules and plows. Mira's marriage to Josiah had been one such arrangement, dissolved not by debt, but by Eliza's quiet directive. Josiah's restlessness deemed a risk after whispers of unrest in the fields. Now, as the twins recovered, Eliza redoubled her efforts, overseeing births with a ledger in hand, ensuring the plantation's human capital endured. Yet even she sensed the fracture. Late at night, she'd hear Whitaker pacing, muttering of moral reckonings that threatened their fragile empire. The silence that followed was not accidental, but engineered, a web spun by those in power to preserve the order. County records from 1857 mention only a vague medical initiative at Willow Bend, funded by Whitaker's own purse to evade scrutiny. Letters to colleagues in Charleston spoke of promising observations on resilience, omitting the screams that had echoed into the dawn. The community beyond the gates, white planters and merchants, preferred the myth intact. To acknowledge the twins' pain would invite questions about their own holdings, their own treatments. Black families in nearby hamlets, bound by their own chains, shared fragments in coded songs and midnight vigils. The doctor's blade cut deep, but the spirit bleeds eternal. Mira, ever resilient, instilled in her sons a quiet faith, teaching them hymns that spoke of deliverance from Egypt's bondage, their voices harmonizing as if to reclaim the unity the experiment had twisted. Years blurred into a haze of endurance. By 1860, as secession loomed, the twins had grown into boys of 8, their scars faint lines hidden beneath homespun shirts. Ebon, the bolder of the pair, took to the fields with a watchful eye, his movements mirroring Silas's even from afar. They spoke little of that night, but their bond had deepened into something unbreakable, a silent pact against the world's cruelties. Whitaker, haunted, turned to opium-laced tonics, his experiments shifting to less invasive pursuits, herbal remedies for field ailments delivered with a hesitance that puzzled the hands. "The doctor sees ghosts now," one elder murmured, as rumors of his declining health spread. The war came like a storm, shattering Willow Bend's illusions. Union troops swept through in 1864, liberating the quarters in a chaos of cheers and gunfire. Mira, frail from years of toil, watched as Eben and Silas fled with others toward freedom's uncertain promise. Whitaker, bedridden, whispered regrets to Eliza, who burned what remained of his notes in the hearth. "For the family's sake," she said, her voice steady even as flames devoured the evidence. The plantation lay abandoned, its fields overgrown, a monument to forgotten sins. Elias closed the journal momentarily, the weight of it pressing into his lap. How had this survived? Donated anonymously, the attendant at the Historical Society had said, perhaps by a Whitaker descendant seeking absolution. But the real unraveling came in the margins, sketches of the twins' faces contorted in pain, and a final entry from 1863. "I sought to prove a lie, and in their truth found my own damnation." Elias's research led him to faded census rolls, confirming Mira's line, descendants scattered across Georgia, carrying stories diluted by time. One name stood out: Lena Hargrove's granddaughter, a librarian in Atlanta who had preserved oral tales of the cut that bound the brothers. As Elias pieced it together, the tragedy's human core emerged. The twins' suffering wasn't isolated. It mirrored the systemic cruelties of an era where bodies were commodities, pains dismissed as myth. Willow Bend's secrets, buried in soil and silence, persisted in the descendants' quiet persistence. Genealogies traced in church basements, whispers reclaimed in community gatherings. The doctor's shock had been personal, but its echo was collective, a reminder that erasure demands vigilance, and truth, though tardy, endures. Yet questions lingered. What became of Eben and Silas, and why had Whitaker's full confession remained hidden for so long? The attic's shadows seemed to deepen, urging Elias onward into the past's unforgiving embrace. Elias Thorne leaned back against the attic's creaking beam, the journal's weight an anchor in his lap, as twilight bled through the cracked window pane. The air in that forgotten corner of the Historical Society felt charged, as if the words on the page had summoned the ghosts of Willow Bend themselves. He traced the faint ink of Whitaker's sketches, the twins' faces etched in hasty lines that captured not just their features but the raw vulnerability of their shared ordeal. It was here, in these margins, that the doctor's facade cracked widest, revealing a man ensnared by his own illusions. Elias's mind wandered back, piecing together the threads of 1858, the year that followed the experiment, when the plantation's rhythms masked a deepening rot. In the wake of that fateful night, Willow Bend carried on as if nothing had shifted, the cotton bolls ripening under a relentless sun that bleached the scars from memory. Whitaker, though shaken, resumed his rounds with a mechanical precision, administering tonics to the field hands and noting their endurance in ledgers that served double duty as alibis. But privately, his doubts festered like an untreated wound. He avoided the twins, delegating their care to Mira, whose eyes now held a steel he hadn't noticed before. She moved through the quarters with a quiet authority, gathering the women in hushed circles under the live oaks, sharing remedies passed down from her grandmother, herbs to soothe fevered brows and mend spirits frayed by the yoke. "The doctor's light is dimming," she'd say softly. Her words a code for the unraveling they all sensed. The hands listened, their nods imperceptible, for in Willow Bend, survival demanded silence as much as strength. Eliza Whitaker, ever the architect of order, sensed the undercurrents and moved to reinforce them. She expanded her program of continuation, orchestrating pairings with a cold efficiency that belied her porcelain fragility. Young women like Mira's niece, barely flowered into adulthood, were matched to seasoned laborers, their unions documented in a private ledger hidden in the big house's study. Eliza justified it as stewardship, a duty to sustain the plantation's vitality amid whispers of unrest from distant abolitionist presses. Yet even she confided in her diary, discovered years later in a trunk of faded linens, that the twins' incident had stirred something uneasy in her. "Harlan speaks of revelations," she wrote in 1858, "but I see only the fragility of our world, the quarters murmur, and I fear the harvest of their grievances." Her role extended beyond births. She oversaw punishments meted out in the shade of the gin house, where discipline left vestiges of suffering that no myth of painlessness could erase. Public corrections, she called them, spectacles to deter whispers of rebellion, though the eyes of the onlookers burned with unspoken defiance. The twins, now 6, navigated this shadowed existence with a bond forged in fire. Ebon and Silas worked the lighter tasks, tending the kitchen garden, fetching water from the spring. Their small frames spared the full brunt of the fields for now, but the experiment had left an indelible mark. They flinched at sharp sounds, their hands clasping instinctively during storms, as if reliving that blade's whisper. Mira watched them like a sentinel, teaching them the art of endurance through stories of ancestors who crossed oceans in chains, yet sang of freedom. "Your pain ain't yours alone," she'd tell them by the hearth's glow, her voice a lullaby laced with resolve. "It's the chain that binds us all, but one day it'll break." The boys absorbed it, their synchronicity evolving into a subtle rebellion. Shared glances that conveyed plans unspoken, small acts of solidarity like slipping extra cornbread to the elders. Whitaker's internal storm brewed toward a quiet crisis. By spring 1858, he confided fragments to a visiting physician from Macon, a fellow enthusiast of mesmerism who shared his library of forbidden texts. Over brandy in the study, Whitaker hinted at his trial, framing it as a controlled observation on neural sympathy. The subject's connection intensified the response, he admitted, his voice low as rain pattered against the shutters. Not diminished, as theory suggested, but magnified, a phenomenon warranting further study. The visitor nodded, intrigued, but urged discretion. Such experiments skirted the edges of legality. Even in Georgia's lax courts, where slave codes forbade unnecessary injury only on paper. Whitaker agreed, but the conversation ignited a reckless impulse. He began documenting covertly, hiding addendums in his journal, charts of the twins' healing, notes on Mira's herbal interventions that outperformed his own remedies. "The resilience is not physiological," he wrote, "but communal, a defiance rooted in the soul." This shift didn't go unnoticed. Rumors seeped into the white community, twisted into tales of Whitaker's eccentric cures that bolstered Willow Bend's output. Planters from neighboring estates visited, seeking his insights on maintaining docile labor, oblivious to the irony. But in the Black Quarters, the narrative was darker. Songs composed in the weaving shed spoke of the doctor's mirror, where pain reflected back tenfold, a warning against trusting the healer's hand. One elder, a grizzled man named Obadiah, who had arrived in Irons decades prior, confronted Whitaker during a fever outbreak. "You cut to prove a lie, massa," he said boldly, his voice steady despite the risk. "But truth bleeds through." Whitaker dismissed him with a tonic and a warning, but the words lingered, echoing his own journaled torments. As summer waned, the plantation's facade held, but fissures widened. Eliza's ledger grew thicker with entries on stock management, her pen scratching out the human cost in sterile terms. The twins, sensing the tension, clung closer. Their laughter rare but genuine in stolen moments by the creek. Mira's faith sustained them, prayers offered at dawn to a God who heard the silenced. Yet the weight pressed. Families torn by sales to cover debts, whispers of underground rails snaking north. Whitaker, isolated in his regrets, turned to Eliza for solace, but she met his confessions with silence, her loyalty to legacy unyielding. "We built this on certainties," she replied once, her eyes distant. "Question them and it crumbles." Elias Thorne rubbed his eyes, the attic's dimness mirroring the era's veiled truths. The journal's 1858 entries ended abruptly, as if Whitaker had sensed prying eyes. But cross-referencing with county abstracts, faded documents Elias had unearthed in the Society's vault, revealed a shadow. A vague lawsuit in 1859, dismissed quietly, alleging mishandling of property. No names mentioned, but the timing aligned. It hinted at the broader complicity, how local elites and clerks buried such matters to protect the system. Descendants like Lena Hargrove's line had preserved the oral echoes, piecing resilience from fragments. Elias wondered if the twins' bond had carried them through the war's chaos, their pain a catalyst for survival. The past's embrace tightened, promising revelations yet to come. Truths that demanded not just unearthing, but reckoning. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you hear this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach. Elias Thorne set the journal aside, his fingers numb from the chill seeping through the attic's warped floorboards. The Historical Society's building, a relic of post-war grandeur in downtown Atlanta, hummed faintly with the distant murmur of traffic, a stark contrast to the timeless hush of Whitaker's confessions. He pulled a worn map from the archive box, tracing the faded outlines of Willow Bend's boundaries, acres that had swallowed so much, yielding only whispers to those who dared listen. The year 1859 beckoned in the journal's sparse entries, a pivot point where Whitaker's private turmoil collided with the plantation's unraveling facade. Elias could almost feel the humid weight of that Georgia summer, the air thick with unspoken reckonings. By 1859, Willow Bend teetered on the edge of its own quiet rebellion, the cotton fields a deceptive veil over brewing discontent. Whitaker had buried his doubts deep, channeling them into a series of preventive measures, lectures to the hands on hygiene and obedience, delivered from the veranda with a fervor that masked his inner fracture. He spoke of the body's mysteries, drawing on the twins' ordeal without naming it, insisting that resilience came not from myth, but from unity. The hands listened warily, their faces impassive masks honed by survival. Mira, now a pillar in the quarters, wove his words into cautionary tales around evening fires, her voice low. The doctor preaches what he fears. Hold your brothers close, for that's where strength lives. Her influence grew subtly, a network of shared glances and hidden gestures that bound the community against the overseer's watchful eye. The twins, at 7, embodied that fragile strength. Eben and Silas had been assigned to the smokehouse, curing hams and preserving the harvest's bounty, their small hands quick and synchronized in tasks that demanded precision. The scars from the experiment had faded to silvery threads, but the memory lingered in their hesitant trust of authority. They avoided Whitaker's infirmary, feigning ailments to stay in the quarters, where Mira's herbs and stories fortified them. One afternoon, as thunder rumbled over the fields, Silas stumbled carrying a heavy crock, spilling brine across the dirt. Eben was there in an instant, steadying him without a word, their bond a silent defiance of the isolation the doctor had imposed. "We heal together," Eben murmured later, echoing Mira's lessons, his eyes fierce with a protectiveness beyond his years. Such moments were lifelines, threads in the tapestry of endurance that the plantation's cruelty sought to fray. Eliza Whitaker, sensing the shift, tightened her grip on the reins of control. Her program of continuation had become a cornerstone of Willow Bend's economy, with births tallied like yields from the gin. She orchestrated unions with a detached precision, favoring pairings that promised robust offspring. Women from the weaving sheds matched to field hands, whose endurance she noted in her ledgers. Mira's family was not spared. Her younger sister was bound to a newcomer from Virginia, their ceremony a hollow affair under the big house's eaves. Eliza oversaw it all, her presence a reminder of the power that demanded compliance. Yet cracks appeared in her resolve. In stolen moments, she'd wander the gardens, her embroidery forgotten, haunted by the twins' muffled cries from that distant night. "Harlan's folly endangers us all," she confided to a cousin in a letter sealed with wax, words that would later surface in family trunks, hinting at her growing unease. Publicly, she maintained the myth, hosting suppers for neighboring mistresses, where tales of docile management flowed like sweet tea, burying any hint of the human fractures beneath. Whitaker's crisis deepened that summer, culminating in a clandestine correspondence with an abolitionist sympathizer disguised as a herbalist from Philadelphia. The letters, smuggled via a circuit rider, revealed his torment. "I sought to affirm the natural order, but the twins' shared anguish unveiled its barbarity. Their pain was not absent, it was a symphony of the soul, demanding we listen." He enclosed sketches from his journal, anonymous pleas for understanding that skirted treason. The response urged caution, warning of spies in the post, but the exchange emboldened him. Whitaker began altering his practices subtly, reducing the overseer's lashings, distributing extra rations during lean months. Acts of atonement veiled as efficiency. The hands noticed, whispers spreading like roots under the soil. The doctor's hand softens, but his shadow lingers. Obadiah the elder, who had confronted him, became an unwitting ally, relaying needs through Mira, forging a fragile bridge across the divide. But complicity's web was vast, ensnaring even those who sought change. The county clerk, a Whitaker kin by marriage, quashed rumors of unrest with forged affidavits, ensuring Willow Bend's records painted a picture of prosperity. Local elites gathered at quarterly fairs, toasting the pseudoscience that justified their world, oblivious or willfully blind to the doctor's wavering faith. One such event in late 1859 nearly unraveled it all. During a demonstration of resilient physiology, Whitaker faltered, his voice cracking as he described neural tolerances. A planter from the next county pressed him, "And your twins, did they bear it as theory predicts?" Whitaker's face paled, the room's laughter a hollow echo. He recovered with a nod, but that night, alone in his study, he scrawled, "The lie chokes me. How long can one man silence a chorus?" In the quarters, life pulsed with quiet persistence. Mira gathered the children, including Eben and Silas, for secret gatherings by the river, teaching them letters scratched in the mud, fragments of literacy smuggled from a freed kin. Their songs, harmonies that mirrored the twins' bond, carried coded messages of hope. The chain may bind, but the spirit flies free. The boys absorbed it, their synchronicity a beacon. Silas's quick mind devised games that sharpened their wits, Eben's courage shielding them from prying eyes. Yet peril loomed. Overseers doubled patrols after reports of agitation from Charleston, and Eliza's ledger noted potential disruptions in the continuation program. Elias Thorne folded the map, his pulse quickening at a marginal note in the journal, a reference to a hidden cache beneath the smokehouse floor, where Whitaker had buried evidence of the truth. Had it survived the war's ravages, cross-referencing with Lena Hargrove's preserved oral histories, tapes donated to the Society revealed echoes, a descendant recalling the doctor's buried shame, unearthed briefly in 1920s excavations before being reinterred. The silence had held for generations, enforced by fear and institutional erasure. But persistence chipped away. Black families in Georgia's hamlets had guarded the fragments, passing them like heirlooms through church networks and family reunions. Elias's discovery promised more, a confrontation with the betrayal that allowed such horrors to fade into myth. As night fell over the attic, Elias pondered the human cost. Families like Mira's, resilient yet scarred, their truths deferred by decades of denial. Whitaker's shock had been the spark, but the fire of revelation burned slow, fueled by descendants who refused forgetting. The past whispered onward, urging him toward Willow Bend's remnants, where soil might yet yield the unspoken. Elias Thorne descended the attic stairs, with the journal clutched under his arm, the Historical Society's corridors echoing his footsteps like distant thunder. Outside, Atlanta's evening haze blurred the skyline, a modern veil over the ghosts he pursued. He needed air, perspective, something to ground the whirlwind of Whitaker's words. Driving south toward the rural fringes where Willow Bend's remnants lay, Elias replayed the doctor's 1860 entries in his mind. The year marked a turning point, where personal hauntings swelled into communal tremors, the plantation's machinery grinding against its own illusions. Elias had cross-referenced them with fragmented Freedmen's Bureau records, yellowed petitions from former hands seeking lost kin. The truths there were sparse but insistent, a world on the brink where silence was both shield and shackle. By 1860, Willow Bend's fields bloomed with a deceptive abundance, cotton stalks heavy under a sun that scorched the earth and souls alike. Whitaker, now gaunt from sleepless nights, wandered the grounds like a man adrift, his medical bag a prop in a theater of denial. The twins' experiment had burrowed into him, a persistent ache that no elixir could dull. He avoided the infirmary's sharper tools, opting instead for consultations by lantern light, listening more than prescribing. Mira caught him once near the quarters, her arms laden with laundry, and met his gaze without flinching. "The boys grow strong, Doctor," she said evenly, her tone a quiet challenge. "Stronger than your proofs." Whitaker nodded, words failing him, and retreated to his study where the journal awaited, pages filling with philosophical digressions on empathy's hidden mechanics, veiled critiques of the era's doctrines. "Pain unites," he wrote, "transcending flesh to forged chains, unbreakable by law or lash." The quarters pulsed with a subdued vitality, families clinging to rituals that defied erasure. Mira had become a matriarch of sorts, her home a nexus for shared burdens. Evenings brought gatherings under the pecan trees, where elders recounted migrations from African shores, their voices weaving resilience into the boys' tender years. Eben and Silas, 8 now, thrived in this cocoon, their bond a living rebuttal to isolation. They tended the communal plot, hands in the soil mirroring each other's rhythms, coaxing vegetables from reluctant ground. Silas's thoughtful pauses drew stories from Obadiah, tales of spectral ancestors who whispered escape routes in dreams. Eben, bolder, tested boundaries, slipping messages in the wash to kin on neighboring farms, fragments of literacy blooming like contraband flowers. Mira watched, her heart a fortress, instilling faith through hummed spirituals. We'll walk the Jordan hand in hand, brothers bound by heaven's plan. Their pain had not broken them. It had annealed, turning vulnerability into quiet power. Eliza Whitaker, from her vantage in the big house, orchestrated the facade with increasing strain. Her continuation program hummed efficiently, births noted in coded entries that blurred humanity into assets. She paired a young weaver with a blacksmith from the forge, their union a calculated infusion of vigor, overseen with a ledger's impartiality. Yet doubts crept in, fueled by Harlan's mutterings and the twins' unyielding gaze during Sunday inspections. Eliza confided in letters to her Savannah kin, sealed against prying eyes. The doctor's revelations unsettled the order we cherish. The quarters hold secrets that mirror our own fractures. Publicly, she hosted teas for the county's wives, extolling Willow Bend's harmony, but her smiles thinned as rumors of northern agitators filtered south. Punishments persisted, overseers enforcing quotas with public admonishments that left echoes of suffering in the air. But Eliza intervened subtly, shortening sentences for mothers with young ones, acts that hinted at a thawing complicity. Whitaker's fragile reforms drew scrutiny. At a planters' assembly in Augusta that spring, he presented a paper on neural fortitude in labor cohorts, skirting his findings with euphemisms. Sympathetic bonds enhance endurance, he claimed, his voice steady but eyes distant. Colleagues applauded, mistaking it for endorsement of the myth, but a sharp-eyed surgeon from Charleston probed, "And in practice, doctor, does the blade confirm it?" Whitaker's pause hung heavy, the room's murmurs a prelude to isolation. Back at Willow Bend, he redoubled his covert aid, herbs for the ailing delayed sales of restless hands, earning wary gratitude from the quarters. Obadiah approached him under cover of dusk. "Your mercy's late but welcome. The twins teach us, pain shared is pain halved." Whitaker moved, shared a vial of laudanum for the elders' aches, a bridge built on regret. Tensions crested in autumn as secession fever gripped Georgia. Whispers of war reached the fields, carried on winds from Charleston. The hands sensed opportunity, their songs sharpening with coded defiance, lines about rivers parting for the faithful. Mira rallied the women, preparing bundles for uncertain flights, her faith a beacon. The twins attuned, practiced signals, whistles mimicking birds, gestures born of their synchronicity. Eliza, overhearing fragments, tightened patrols, her ledger now tracking loyalty assessments. Harlan, torn, penned a final urgent letter to his Philadelphia contact. The veil thins. The twins' truth heralds a reckoning. Our society's lie cannot endure the light of their bond. But the post faltered, the missive lost to time. Complicity's machinery churned on. The county judge, Whitaker's distant cousin, dismissed a petition from a field hand alleging unnatural treatments, sealing it with wax and whispers. Local merchants, profiting from Willow Bend's output, spread tales of its benevolence, burying anomalies in ledgers of trade. Black communities in hamlets nearby preserved the undercurrents orally, church deacons noting the doctor's mirror trial in baptismal rites, a cautionary sacrament. Families like Mira's endured, their persistence a slow erosion of silence, truths passed like heirlooms, through bloodlines scarred but unbroken. Elias arrived at Willow Bend's overgrown site as stars pricked the sky, the soil underfoot whispering of buried layers. He knelt by a weathered stone, Mira's unmarked grave per local law, and sifted dirt, imagining the hidden cache Whitaker mentioned. No shovel yielded it that night, but the journal's echoes guided him. 1860s fragile balances foreshadowed collapse. Cross-checks with descendants' archives revealed more, a great niece of Silas's recalling the year the brothers' light pierced the dark, her words taped in the 1970s. The revelation's delay, spanning generations, underscored the betrayal. Elites who torched papers, clerks who redacted names, all to safeguard a rotting order, yet faith persisted. Mira's line, tracing genealogies in community centers, reclaiming voices from the void. As Elias drove back, the road unspooling like journal pages, he felt the weight of tardy justice. Whitaker's shock had rippled outward, exposing not just one man's folly, but a system's callous core. Forced pairings, dismissed pains, families commodified. The twins' bond, amplified in agony, became legend, a testament to human depths the myths denied. Questions mounted. How did war shatter Willow Bend? And what final confessions did Whitaker withhold? The past's grip tightened, promising deeper unveilings in the chapters, yet to turn. Elias Thorne returned to the Historical Society's dim reading room the next morning, the journal's edges frayed from his relentless turning. Coffee steamed untouched on the table as he delved into the 1861 entries, where Whitaker's script grew feverish, mirroring the nation's fracturing. The doctor's words painted Willow Bend not as a bastion of order, but a fragile edifice cracking under the weight of its own deceptions. Elias's notes sprawled across legal pads, cross-references to Confederate muster rolls, petitions from emancipated souls seeking kin lost to the programs of places like this. The air hummed with the society's quiet bustle, but Elias felt isolated, adrift in a sea of silenced histories that demanded reckoning. By early 1861, as Georgia seceded and drums of war echoed from the coast, Willow Bend clung to its rhythms like a dying breath. Whitaker, hollow-eyed from opium's haze, patrolled the fields with a detachment that bordered on despair. The twins' revelation had metastasized into a broader disillusionment. He saw now how the myth of insensibility propped up not just experiments, but the entire edifice of bondage, forcing pairings, enduring discipline, all justified by a lie of detached flesh. In his journal he confessed, "The blade I wielded cut deeper than skin. It severed the veil, revealing a humanity we dared not face. Mira's sons, in their mirrored torment, indict us all." He ceased his overt treatments, confining himself to palliative herbs, but the damage lingered. An overseer, emboldened by Whitaker's absence, meted out public corrections with renewed zeal, vestiges of suffering rippling through the quarters like aftershocks. Mira stood as the unyielding heart of that community, her presence a quiet rebellion against the encroaching chaos. She had woven a network of support, women trading remedies and men sharing whispers of northern lines snaking through the swamps. The twins, 9 now, moved through this web with instinctive grace, their bond a compass in the storm. Ebon scouted the perimeter during errands, noting patrol's weaknesses, while Silas committed routes to memory, his mind a map of possible freedoms. They worked the harvest with feigned obedience, hands blistering on bowls that funded the war effort, but evenings brought stolen solace by the fire. Mira's tales of ancestral spirits who guided the chained across waters, her voice steady. "Your light shines through the dark, boys. It binds us, unbreakable." Their synchronicity had evolved into empathy's sharp edge. When a neighbor endured a forced union under Eliza's directive, the twins slipped her a charm from Mira's stores, a talisman against despair. Eliza Whitaker navigated the turmoil with a steely pragmatism, her continuation efforts redirected toward sustaining the plantation's output for Confederate quartermasters. She paired laborers with clinical detachment, ledger entries noting essential alliances to replace those conscripted or fled. One such arrangement bound a young field hand to Mira's kin, the ceremony a stark affair amid rising tensions. Eliza's oversight a reminder of power's persistence even as the world shifted. Yet war's shadow softened her edges. Letters to absent relatives revealed cracks. Harlan's ghosts haunt these halls. The quarter's silence grows heavy, pregnant with what we cannot name. She intervened in small ways, delaying sales of families with children, attributing it to labor shortages, but complicity's chains held firm. At county meetings, she defended Willow Bend's loyalty, burying hints of Whitaker's wavering in tales of unyielding productivity, her words a balm for elites fearful of unrest. Whitaker's torment peaked that spring. As enlistments thinned, the overseers and rumors of Union advances stirred the air. He sought solace in clandestine meetings with Obadiah, the elder's wisdom a counterpoint to his isolation. Under cover of a mock inspection, Whitaker murmured, "The twins showed me the lie. We all feel deeply in ways our laws forbid." Obadiah's reply was measured. "Truth don't need your proof, Doctor. It lives in the songs we sing when your back's turned." Emboldened, Whitaker hid supplies for potential flight, bandages, food caches, acts of atonement that risked everything. But betrayal loomed. A spied-upon conversation reached the ears of a Confederate informant, a merchant kin, who reported it as disloyal mutterings. The county clerk, ever the guardian of order, quashed the inquiry with redacted affidavits, preserving the facade while isolating Whitaker further. In the quarters, persistence bloomed amid peril. Mira's gatherings swelled, spirituals harmonizing into anthems of deliverance, the twins' voices leading choruses that masked plans. Ebon and Silas practiced signals, flashes of cloth mimicking fireflies, preparing for the moment the chains might snap. Families endured separations, husbands marched off or sold to bolster defenses, but faith knit them. Prayers at dawn, invoking a justice beyond earthly courts. One night, as cannon fire rumbled distantly, Silas confided in Ebon, "Our pain was the first crack. Now the whole world's breaking." Their bond, born of that illegal test, had become a beacon, amplifying not just suffering, but hope's quiet roar. As summer scorched the fields, war's inexorable tide neared. Whitaker, sensing the end, buried his journal's addendum in the smokehouse cache, a final testament. If freedom comes, let it honor the twins' truth. The pain we denied was the soul's cry for equity. Eliza discovered fragments, burning them in silent fury, her loyalty to legacy a final act of erasure. The hands watched, their oral legacies already encoding the tale. The doctor's shock opened the door, but we walked through it ourselves. Elias paused his reading, the society's clock tolling noon like a dirge. Cross-referencing with war diaries from the Georgia Historical Collection revealed Willow Bend's fall in 1864. Union foraging parties liberating the quarters in a blur of chaos. But the journal hinted at prelude, a midnight exodus in 1862, Mira and the twins among the first to slip away, guided by Whitaker's hidden aid. Descendants' accounts, preserved in family Bibles and 20th century interviews, confirmed it, Ebon and Silas reaching contraband lines, their bond carrying them north. The delay in revelation over a century exposed the betrayal. Elites who torched archives, judges who sealed dockets, all to let myths fester. Yet Mira's line persisted, genealogists in Atlanta churches tracing paths from Willow Bend to modern reclamations, faith turning forgetting into fuel. Elias gathered his materials, the weight of tardy truths settling like Georgia dust. Whitaker's shock had ignited a slow burn, exposing the system's core, abuse veiled as science, families commodified in silence. As war loomed in the narrative, Elias wondered, what final echoes did the plantation yield, and how did the twins' survival reshape the silenced legacy? The story's threads tightened, pulling toward revelation's unforgiving light. If this story has gripped you already, leave a like. This helps the story of Mira and her twins reach more people. Elias Thorne stood amid the tangled underbrush of what was once Willow Bend's smokehouse foundation, the Georgia sun filtering through kudzu vines like fractured memories. His shovel bit into the earth, unearthing roots and relics from a soil that had long guarded its secrets. The journal's final entries, scrawled in Whitaker's trembling hand from 1862, had led him here. A cryptic note about the buried cache, a desperate bid for posterity amid the war's encroaching roar. Elias's heart pounded as he sifted the dirt, the weight of over a century pressing down. This was no mere excavation. It was a confrontation with the silence that had swallowed Mira's family, the twins' truth, and the plantation's veiled cruelties. By 1862, Willow Bend trembled on the precipice, the distant thunder of battles at Shiloh and Antietam echoing like judgments deferred. Whitaker, a shadow of his former self, moved through the days in a haze of regret and resolve. The twins' shared agony had become his unrelenting spectre, unraveling the pseudoscience that once armored his conscience. He saw it now in every forced union Eliza orchestrated, every public correction that left whispers of torment in the quarters. The myth of insensibility, a scaffold for an empire built on denial. In hidden addendums to his journal, he chronicled the human fractures. The programs of continuation are not stewardship, but chains disguised as lineage. Mira's sons expose the lie, their pain, doubled in bond, mirrors the collective wound we inflict. He ceased his complicit rounds, confining himself to the big house, where opium dulled the edges, but not the visions of those synchronized screams. Mira, the unyielding core of the quarters, sensed the shifting tides and acted with a faith forged in endurance. She had expanded her circle of quiet defiance, women brewing tonics that masked preparations for flight, men etching maps in the dust under moonlight. The twins, 10 now, were her sharpest allies. Eben's daring scouting weak points in the fences, Silas's memory charting paths through the swamps toward rumored Union lines. Their bond, amplified by that illegal test, had transformed suffering into strategy. They moved as one, hands brushing in silent reassurance during the harvest's grueling hours. "The doctor's cut bound us tighter than any yoke," Eben confided one eve by the river, his voice low as fireflies danced. Silas nodded, adding, "And it'll carry us free." Mira enveloped them in prayer. Her words a shield. "The Lord who parted seas our mirrored light. Hold fast, my hearts, we cross together." Eliza Whitaker clung to control amid the unraveling, her ledger a frantic tally of dwindling labor. War had thinned the ranks, forcing pairings that bordered on desperation, young souls matched to sustain the fields for Confederate wagons rolling south. She oversaw it with a facade of necessity, but cracks widened. A letter to her fading kin confessed, "Harlan's revelations poison the air, the quarter's harmony frays, and I fear the harvest of truths long buried." Publicly, she rallied the county's mistresses, sharing veiled accounts of Willow Bend's resilience, but privately, she burned Whitaker's stray notes. Her acts of erasure a desperate loyalty to the world they'd built. Punishments persisted under her watchful eye, overseers enforcing order with admonishments that echoed the twins' night, but she shortened some, attributing it to scarce hands, hints of a conscience stirring too late. The breaking point came in the sweltering July of 1862, as Union scouts probed Georgia's borders. Whitaker, in a final act of atonement, slipped provisions to Obadiah under cover of a fever clinic. Dried meats, a compass pilfered from his study, maps sketched from memory. "For the twins," he whispered, his eyes hollow. "Tell Mira their pain was my awakening." Obadiah accepted warily, relaying it through the chain. That midnight, as rain lashed the fields, Mira led the exodus, 24 souls, including Ebon and Silas, slipping past lax patrols toward the swamps. The twins flanked her, their steps synchronized, hands linked in the dark. Gunfire cracked distantly, but they pressed on, the bond that had amplified their torment now guiding their flight. Willow Bend awoke to absence, the quarters echoing with a silence that finally spoke. Whitaker discovered the escape at dawn, his journal's last frantic entry. "They are gone, as truth demands. My shock at their pain was but the prelude. Freedom's light reveals the depth of our betrayal." He collapsed soon after, his decline swift and unspoken, dying in 1863 as Sherman's march loomed. Eliza survived the war's fury. The big house torched in 1864, its ashes scattering evidence like confetti. She retreated to Savannah, her ledgers and letters buried in family trunks, complicity's remnants preserved in whispers among elites who rebuilt on forgotten foundations. Elias's shovel struck something solid, a rusted tin, pried open to reveal Whitaker's cache. Blood-stained cloths from the experiment, a locket with Mira's initials, and sealed letters confessing the full scope. The illegal test, the forced programs, the myth's role in silencing suffering. Tears blurred Elias's vision as he pieced it together, cross-referencing with descendants' archives. Ibn and Silas had reached contraband camps, their bond sustaining them through Reconstruction's perils. Ibn settled in Philadelphia, a blacksmith whose stories fueled abolitionist circles. Silas farmed in Atlanta, his family line, Lena Hargrove's kin, guarding oral truths through Jim Crow's shadows. They never spoke publicly of the test, the pain too raw, but their lives embodied persistence, churches built, genealogies traced, silences broken in family law. The revelations, emerging in 2024 through Elias's work, cast a tardy light on Willow Bend's legacy. For over 160 years, betrayal had thrived. Clerks redacting dockets, planters torching papers, communities enforcing forgetting to preserve fragile orders. The myth of painlessness had justified not just one doctor's hubris, but a system's architecture. Abuses of power veiled as science, families commodified in ledgers of denial. Yet memory endured in the margins, oral tales in Black Georgia hamlets, artifacts unearthed by persistent hands. Mira's descendants, gathering in community halls, reclaimed the narrative. Our pain was proof, not myth, a bond that outlasted chains. Justice came late, in archives dusted off and graves finally marked, but it came, fueled by faith that refused erasure. Elias sealed the cache, the weight of it a promise. Willow Bend's soil had yielded its ghosts, exposing the human depths the era denied. The twins' story, from shadowed shed to modern reckoning, whispered of resilience's quiet victory over forgetting, a reminder that truths, though buried deep, rise when sought. Subscribe to the channel to discover more forbidden and forgotten stories. Thank you for following the case of Willow Bend Plantation. See you in the next video.